Few non-Nintendo made games from the 80s have the same following, longevity, and influence of Castlevania. It's gone through a few changes since the first game, but the original Castlevania brought a sense of horror and fright that games really didn't have at the time. And it's really hard. And like many games originating in the 80s, the music in each new title introduces new themes while constantly remaking old ones. This whole month, I want to do several episodes, all focusing on the many great soundtracks of Castlevania, not only because of the Halloween season, but also because series maker Konami doesn't seem especially interested in preserving the series and its legacy. But for the next few episodes, let's focus on the positives, the Castlevania series from the first title up to Harmony of Despair, the last of the non-Lords of Shadow Castlevanias. This episode will be an overview of the first half of the series, and then I'll do another one about the next half. And to finish it off, I want to have an episode about the recurring tracks in the series. But first, let's start from the beginning. There are essentially three types of Castlevania games: the linear platformers, the more open exploratory platformers, the Vania part of Metroidvania, and the 3D games. The first game is linear, and it's a lot slower paced and requires way more situational awareness than most other platformers at the time. Musically, Castlevania kicks off the Bach meets rock style that most of the series has. The game takes place in 1691, which is considered to be the beginning of the late Baroque era. This is the era where Bach was on top, although at the time of the game he only would have been 6 years old, and he wasn't the kind of composer that had already written a symphony by age 8. The series' music takes a lot of notes, figuratively and literally, from this era of music, and from classical music, with a healthy dose of rock thrown in. A prominent feature in all the Castlevania games is the Alberti bass, which sounds like this. Although it's used primarily as the bass in classical music, the first usage in the game is during the boss fights, where it's higher up and the low notes play the melody. Technically speaking, the first game was pretty straightforward, as composers in this early NES time hadn't quite figured out all the tricks the system was capable of. However, the soundtrack features some very memorable tracks, such as the main track Vampire Killer, that drives you forward while making the player feel slightly uneasy. Moving along to Castlevania II: Simon's Quest from 1987, also for the NES. This game is much more open, starting in a town where you can talk to various villagers and leave to explore the surrounding area. There's even a day-night cycle where the music gets spookier and the enemies get harder. However, the ideas look a lot better on paper than they feel in the game, and this title is considered the worst of the NES Castlevania games. It definitely hasn't aged very well, and while one could argue that most future Castlevania games take a lot more after 2 than 1, all of those games do it supremely better. The major element that didn't suffer in this entry is the music, the most famous of which is Bloody Tears. The drums here are using the DPCM sample channel from the NES, meaning that it's a very short 1-bit sample that's playing the drums. These usually sound kinda silly on their own, as they're really compressed and usually sped up to make them short and thus take up less space on the cartridge. But the NES can slow down the sample, drawing it out and making it sound more convincing. Next is the first portable title, Castlevania: The Adventure, released in 1989 for the Game Boy. This game tries really hard, and I give the developers credit for that. But people just quite hadn't figured out how to get the most out of the Game Boy's hardware, so the game runs terribly and you move so slow. All Castlevania games are slow, but this one is glacial, which makes platforming even worse. However, the soundtrack is the highlight. The tracks very much feel like Castlevania, with a slow but driving sound to match the even slower gameplay. But it's very clear that this is an incredibly early Game Boy game, and the music doesn't reach the heights that other games in the series do. In the same year for the NES came Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse. Gameplay-wise, Castlevania III marked a return to the original game's style, as was the case in the third entry of many games from that time. The game is still plenty fun today and holds up the best among the 8-bit Castlevanias in my opinion. Soundtrack-wise, there's a strange disparity between the Japanese Famicom versions and the Western NES release. In the West, we got another excellent Castlevania soundtrack, including a few callbacks to the original game. But in Japan, the game featured a new technology created by Konami called the VRC6 chip. I talked a good bit about the VRC-6 chip in the Shovel Knight episodes, but as a reminder, VRC-6 is an expansion chip that adds 2 pulse channels and a sawtooth channel. This creates a much more lush and full sound, but it sounds a little odd as it's not as familiar to the NES. It feels almost more like it could be on a Genesis. Konami only used the VRC-6 chip on 3 games, and none of these games came to the West. This means there are 2 versions of every track for Castlevania III, and when you look up the soundtrack, you usually see the Japanese title, Akumaju Densetsu, next to the VRC-6 versions of the track. Both versions are worth listening to and add an interesting layer to an already great game soundtrack. Confusingly, in 1991 we get Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge for the Game Boy. This game definitely feels better than the first Game Boy game, but it still suffers from an infuriatingly slow walk speed. But the music takes advantage of the Game Boy's stereo capabilities. This is limited to hard panning to the left or right, meaning the composer could have the instruments play only in the left channel, only in the right channel, or equally in both. This is primarily used for an echo effect and can only really be heard if the player had on headphones, as the Game Boy system only had 1 speaker. But this stereo makes listening to the music fun because many of the tracks only use the panning in the B section, so it kinda takes you by surprise. The main Castlevania release of 1991 is Super Castlevania IV. Like many early SNES games, this game seems to be yelling at you at how cool the SNES is, as in the first 5 minutes you get a ton of features the NES could never dream of, like diagonal whipping, melting sprites, and lots of reverb. The game itself is a ton of fun and holds up incredibly well. It's also intriguing to look at how changing just one mechanic, the whip directions, can completely change the game. The music is way more subtle than any other previous game was capable of, and I think it's more subtle than almost any other Castlevania game just in general. Of all the game soundtracks, this one's the best to listen to as background music. This next one's strange. Castlevania Rondo of Blood came out in 1993 in Japan on the PC Engine CD, which is known as the TurboGrafx 16 CD in the West. Rondo of Blood never had an unaltered release in the West until it came to the Virtual Console on the Wii in 2010. However, there was a release on the SNES in 1995 called Dracula X, which was basically the same game, but of course didn't have all the fancy cutscenes, voice acting, and CD audio that Rondo of Blood had. Although after listening to it, I believe the SNES game generally holds up better. There's some great tracks that would have been mind-blowing to hear in 1993, but there's also... As most music from the early CD era in games, anything using real instruments sounds great, and anything using samples from the time sounds cheesy and dated. But I can't help but love some of these tracks. Castlevania Bloodlines came out for the Sega Genesis in 1994, and it's the first soundtrack in the series created by recurring Castlevania composer Michiru Yamane. It's the only Castlevania game for the Genesis, and you can definitely hear the Genesis sound. The game is linear and features music very true to the early entries with some classical influences and a driving simple drum beat. But while it's on the Genesis, Yamane avoids many of the gross metallic sounds the Genesis is infamous for, and the panning drums are used seldom and effectively. Next is the big one, the game that completely changed the direction of the series, 1997's Castlevania Symphony of the Night. This was the first game produced by Koji Igarashi and introduced many elements from Metroid, including a world where you could explore and map out areas instead of purely following a linear track. This game, and most of the Castlevania games to follow, is the reason the genre is usually referred to as Metroidvania. The PS1 could have meant a jump to 3D, but Konami kept true to the 2D tradition of the series, and created a PS1 game that still holds up incredibly well to this day. The features that are dated, like the occasional voice acting,
"Time, monster! You don't belong in this world!"
and some of the music, are more endearing than distracting, as the core gameplay and art is well realized. The music varies between many different styles, from rock, to choral, to classical. But kind of silly 90s J-rock is the main style. I could and very well may do an entire episode on this game, but this episode's already running long, so I'll leave you on the silliest and 90th song, the credit song, I Am the Wind. Stay tuned for the rest of the main series games, and listen well.